He needs no introduction. You were just listening to President Trump's bilateral press conference with Turkey's President Erdogan at the NATO summit in Turkey. With that, let's bring in our lead-off panel. Susan Glasser is here, staff writer for The New Yorker. Sam Stein, managing editor for The Bulwark and MS Now political contributor. And Lieutenant General Mark Hertling, a retired commander of the U.S. Army Europe and an MS Now military analyst. General, let's start right there with the president's comments. With regard to the war with Iran, he said it is not even a war. It's just a military operation.
I think he called it a special military operation, which sounds eerily familiar to what President Putin was calling the invasion in Ukraine. It is a war, Stephanie. I mean, it meets every definition of war that I've ever read in history books or doctrine or military theory. So it's just a canard that he's throwing out there to say, yeah, this is no big deal. We won. Everything's fine. But last night we saw more ships being struck by Iranian drones. It's just a mishmash of information that he's passing off to the press in Ankara.
Susan, let's talk about why the president is there, this NATO meeting. What is at stake? Because it seems like as the whole world is watching, the goal for these other leaders is to avoid Donald Trump's wrath. That doesn't seem like a forward-looking, productive NATO agenda.
Yeah, you have a problem when the strongest partner that's supposed to be the leader in the alliance has now become the major threat inside the alliance. And I think for the last year, and in particular ever since the beginning of this year, Steph, there's been a growing sense of alarm with U.S. NATO allies that their previous strategy of Trump management, which might be characterized as sort of flattery of a very dangerous toddler, that's no longer working, that is not a viable long-term strategy. And, I mean, you're hearing polite terms like NATO 3.0, which i.e. means a NATO with less America in it, less polite terms like de-Americanization of NATO. And, that's not really viable. I mean, I leave it to the general to explain why it is that the U.S. capabilities, not just the U.S. nuclear umbrella, are so indispensable to securing Europe. But just listening to Donald Trump right now, you can see the crisis that Trump represents for Europe, which is the value neutral way in which he describes the bloodiest war in Europe since World War II, launched in an unprovoked invasion by Russia on its neighbor. That is a genuine, actual, everyday security threat to the United States' NATO allies. And yet to listen to Donald Trump is to hear basically, well, there's two sides, they're fighting, they're far away, and it doesn't concern us. That's the threat I think that NATO actually faces right now, is its own partner, Donald Trump.
That's the threat. You just heard from Donald Trump basically mischaracterizing whether it's the war in Ukraine or the war in Iran. And John Bolton wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post, Sam, and he said the goal of this NATO meeting is simply do no harm. Quote, if nothing happens in Ankara, that would be a victory for the alliance. What does that say, that the goal is to have nothing happen while there's two wars going on?
Brings to mind the statement, bigotry of low expectations. We should be expecting more from the most important transatlantic alliance in history. Obviously, Susan laid out some of the big stakes. Putting an end to what's happening with the war in Ukraine is obviously top of mind. And then, of course, what's happening in Iran, resolving the Strait of Hormuz. You can add to that the administration of Gaza, which is kind of back burner now, but obviously is an important geopolitical priority here. And I'm struck, I guess, by what is sort of classically Trumpian, just the kind of like, they're not, I don't want to call them sort of mild distractions because they're not mild and they're not insignificant, but they are distractions and provocations that are so unnecessary. So the two things, right? One is taking that question about Greenland at the end and relitigating the acquisition of Greenland for what must be the 10th time now. It's a needless provocation of a NATO ally that has been already, we've gone through this chapter and verse, and here we are again talking about it. And the other one is what to do with Prime Minister Meloni in Italy. Yesterday on Truth Social, he did post about her saying restraining order needed. And for what purpose? He says it's because they didn't help out with the Strait of Hormuz. And maybe so, but you don't need to do that in public. And just this morning, It's sort of sent the Italian government into a bit of a frantic tizzy where they have to decide what to do about this. Meloni had stood up to Trump publicly the last time he went after her. And now the Italian ministers are all saying, well, we just can't respond. We're not going to take the bait. She'll engage him with a smile at the summit, but that's it. And imagine having to waste the time and energy and resources figuring out how to handle the president's social media provocations when so much more could be done during these summits. That's what Bolton's getting at, is that if you just don't do damage, I guess that's a victory.
Okay, well, it's not just public statements, but it's public actions that world leaders now have to respond to. General, quickly, before we go to break, the current president was the one who banned Turkey from buying these stealth fighters back in 2019. Now he's apparently changing his mind. What do you make of this move? And why are these planes so important? Because it was just yesterday Netanyahu urged him not to do this.
Well, I think he's seeing the F-35 issue as a way to repair the strategic relationship with Turkey, which has been damaged. And it's also to strengthen his personal relationship with President Erdogan, who I think we saw that just now. Turkey has NATO's second largest military. They occupy an extraordinarily important geographic position between Europe, Russia, Middle East, Black Sea, and Trump wants Washington to benefit from pulling Ankara closer and rather than allowing it to drift apart. He banned Turkey from having the F-35s because of their purchase of Russia air defense systems. This is the important point, Stephanie. The fact that they bought the S-400 air defense system from Russia, and if you have aircraft from the United States, you can determine how those air defense systems can best shoot down the aircraft. So you don't want to sell your aircraft to a country that has Russian air defense systems. But now it seems the president is just making decisions from a transactional level, as we've seen him do so many times before.